Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Sally Charno, and along with my colleague and co-coordinator and friend, Judy Coffin, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's French Press, New Books in Francophone History. And today's conversation will be between Hilary Bernstein and Michael Breen, and they'll be talking about Hilary's new book, Cities, Erudition, and National Identity in Early Modern France, which recently came out from Brill. So just a note, this is a program of the Society for French Historical Studies, and the Society offers a variety of programming in support of the history of France, the Francophone world, and beyond. From online discussions like this one, French Press, to virtual and in-person conferences, and small gatherings to large meetings, we promote a scholarly community that's committed to showcasing the work of new and older scholars. With that said, I want to lift up that Tabitha Ewing is with us today here, and she is the new executive director of the Society for French Historical Studies, which is really good news for all of us. Before we begin, I just want to say that you probably noticed we have a lot of security on and you can't turn your videos on or unmute yourself. We started doing that when we first started French Press because there were a lot of sort of disgruntled folks around. We've kept doing it just because it's neater and cleaner, and so I will open the chat though for your questions. So with that said, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Judy Coffin.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for coming. At least in Austin, Texas, a new afternoon. And thank you to Hilary and Michael for agreeing to do this. I'm going to introduce them very quickly. We don't have a lot of time on Sunday afternoon, so I will be able to talk about their many accomplishments. But let me start with Hilary, who is professor of history at Santa Barbara. She's published a really impressive number of wide-ranging articles in early modern French history, written about cities, learned culture, miracle, big essays on new direction, modern. Sally just told you about her most recent book, which we're going to talk about today, History of Community, Cities, Erudition, and National. With a very prestigious, very expensive Brill, and Hilary is going to put in the chat at several points a discount code. Get it at 25% off. Before Historical Community, wrote between Crown and Community, Politics, Culture, and most recently has actually edited an entire issue on Colbert, venality, and judicial elites during the long 70s. She's been visiting professor just last year at Nantes. Before that, in 2000, the École des Hautes. Last but not least, she was a long-time co-editor. So thank you. Thank you for doing this. The question sort of dialogue is Hilary and Michael Breen. Michael's professor in humanities at Reed College. He does social, cultural, and legal history. He's written Law, City, and Legal Culture, State Formation, Early Modern, and many articles on urban politics. France. Currently working on two projects. The first, a broad gauge law and society, medieval, modern. And second, an archival study on marital annulment trial, delicious title, dueling under the banner of Venus, marriage law and authority in the épreuve du concret. And last but not least, he too we are all indebted to him. He is currently completing his second year as editor-in-chief of H. So welcome to both of you.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear? Well, I guess I don't know if people can respond if everyone can hear me. I always want to make sure the technology is working. And also, if you have questions, I think just to make clear, please send them to me in the chat. And then when we get to the general the sort of general discussion later on, then I can sort of relay those questions to Hilary. But I want to, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of French Presse for putting this together, and for Hilary for inviting me to participate in this discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. Hilary is one of my oldest friends and colleagues in the profession. Oldest as in being longest term, I should say, just to clarify. Going back to graduate school when we sort of connected over our shared interest in early modern French urban history. And so it's a real pleasure for me to participate in this discussion today. And I wanted to start, Hilary, with the title of your book, Historical Communities, because I think it does a great job of capturing the complexity of the subject matter and your argument and what you're trying to do in this book. Because at first glance, I might say, well, this is an intellectual history about érudits and local histories in the 16th and 17th centuries. Certainly those of us who have worked on early modern urban history have encountered these people and their works. But ultimately, it's as much a social history as an intellectual one. So I'd be interested in hearing more about how you think studying research and writing practices can help us better understand intellectual activity and the production and circulation of ideas in early modern France.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Just before I begin to answer that, I also wanted to thank our organizers, Sally and Judy, for making this kind of conversation possible over Zoom, which is wonderful. And also thanks to you, Michael, for agreeing to participate in this discussion. When I was thinking about who would I actually want to talk to about my book, you were the very first person that I thought of. And yes, indeed, our shared interests go back longer than we both probably would care to admit. Okay, yeah, so historical communities. So just for those of you who perhaps haven't actually read the book, yeah, I kind of meant it as a, sort of a phrase of double meaning. Historical communities being the cities and towns themselves invested with a history, and the groups of people who are interested in local history and indeed often wound up collaborating in writing or sort of assembling the notions of the past, mostly in the provincial cities in France in the 16th and the first half of the 17th century. So yeah, Michael, I agree with you that when I was writing this book, I did not imagine it as sort of solely an intellectual history, but as much as I could as a kind of a sort of a social, cultural, political history, in addition to just what were people actually saying about cities. Although I guess I would just say it's a social history sort of along the lines of a kind of a social history of ideas. I wouldn't want anyone to think that, there's information about, I don't know, marriage strategies or something in this book. It's very much about, who constituted the community of people who were so sort of invested in the history of their town to the extent of sort of participating in the writing of it. And I guess the idea too being that it's not just local people, but also that the interest in local sources and in local history sort of follows pathways of research and analysis from individual communities to a much broader community. And so the historical community is also, well, Michael, as you said, there's this community of erudits who basically need local sources in order to really do any kind of historiographical work that's going to just go beyond, say, the history of the monarchy. So in thinking about it as a kind of a social history of ideas, I think I'm trying to do this for local people in the way that perhaps people who have been more focused on, what we call the Republic of Letters in general think of when they think of a social history of ideas. So meaning that there is a kind of overlap of practices and politeness within a kind of a self-limiting group who are interested in exchanges of ideas and information and sources, and also a kind of what you're talking about, the Republic of Letters, an approach to French politics and the French monarchy overall. So to more now to your particular question, which is how does studying research and writing practices help us better understand intellectual history and the production of ideas? And so I think, as I've already sort of begun to say, I think that it helps us move past a kind of a compartmentalized view, where individual writers, get their own ideas and they write their own stuff. Rather, what it does is it puts us into a whole constellation of people who are interested in related topics, and often not for exactly the same reason, but who nevertheless have a kind of a language of exchange and sort of models of exchange that enable a sort of a broader research process, which then allows local people to really situate their work, like within a broader understanding, and connects them, into a broader community of people who are going to sort of bring them out of their own just sort of like individual, kind of their individual intellectual or political questions. So I guess in that way, that's what a social history of ideas can do for us. And it was sort of very much kind of the methodology that I wound up pursuing.
No, I think, sort of rereading your book before doing this, I mean, it struck me that the way it was in dialogue, both with the scholarship on the Republic of Letters, and, the sort of, polite society, and all of that. And, I kept going back to one of my favorite sort of books of all time, which is Steve Chapin's Social History of Truth. But at the same time, that this is really coming out of your work, particularly your first book, Poitiers Between Crown and Community, which is really a social and a political history and a study of kind of civic culture in 16th century Poitiers. Right? And you have a couple of lines in the introduction which talk about the kind of the political, often the kind of social and political, the local social and political dimensions at stake in these histories. And so there's always this sort of dialogue, this push and pull between the local and the national. I'm wondering if you could say again a little bit more about how the fact that, this book is shaped by the fact that you approached it as an urban historian, as opposed to, say, a kind of intellectual historian per se. And I realize those are not neat divisions, but that someone who is coming at this maybe from a kind of Donald Kelly, Anthony Grafton perspective, which you're certainly in dialogue with, might come at it differently. So how did your sort of social history approach influence what you did, or how you viewed the topic?
I definitely the fact that I came at it as I had been working on the history of Poitiers in the 16th century, well, through the reign of Henry IV, definitely influenced the way I approached this. It certainly influenced where I began. As I just mentioned briefly, I didn't plan to write a book on urban histories to begin with. Rather, I was interested in the way in Poitiers people, sort of municipal officials used their own past as a kind of a language in which they communicated with the French crown. And that just made me wonder, is this something that is unique to Poitiers, or is this the way many or all French towns communicated with the monarchy? I mean, I suspected that, yes, I would find parallel situations, but did it matter that, Poitiers is a town that got a lot of its privileges as a result of the 100 Years' War, and it actually had some pretty developed urban privileges? When I find something completely different in Bordeaux, for example? And so that's kind of where I started. And so where I really began this project was kind of in the world of books of privileges in particular. And so that kind of became chapter 2. But that's where I started, because that's where you can really see urban elites articulating a usable past, which they're then going to deploy when they want to either keep their privileges or enhance them, in relationship to the monarchy. And these books of privileges, too, are where urban elites also, in a sense, kind of educate the population at large about what their privileges actually are, and sometimes how to actually go about using them. So at the same time, these are very interesting sources that look, up to the crown and, either sideways or sort of down-ish, to literate, commercial people who might actually want to make use of these privileges. So definitely that influenced me strongly. And then I think you're absolutely right that being interested in urban culture and politics in particular definitely influenced the way that I read these histories. Yes, I think, probably somebody who came to this from more of an intellectual history angle might have done what I did not do, which was to read these works, like all of them that were published, integrally, comparatively, section by section. And that is definitely not what I did. And that would certainly be a viable project, and it would yield interesting results. But yes, it would that. But rather what I did, and these works, we should say, are, a very variable quality, and they don't all have sort of the same elements. And what I find the most interesting about them is actually their quirky. So, and the ways that the authors sometimes sort of intrude themselves and even their own life histories, or the way that you can tell that a very particular conflict, local conflict, has completely influenced, what they deem important to say. And so that is really what interested me, I guess. And because I already, had, well, at least one foot, let's say both feet, in this world, of conflict and competition, among urban families, etc. I felt like I could kind of almost sort of see these things happening through the lines of these histories. And so that is how I approached them. And I guess I should say that that's kind of the way I approach all early modern texts, rather than just kind of reading them for, okay, what do they say? I tend to read them for, like, what does this tell us about the people who are writing them, and like what was on their mind, and what did they actually have to do to produce this? And so, yeah, so I think that approach where, in my book on Poitiers, I was reading town council deliberations. I was constantly reading those for, okay, what's really going on? And I think I sort of used the same approach here. It's like, okay, what's really going on? Why is this so important, to the people who are saying this? And then just one other thing. And then, so when I wanted to talk about the relationship between sources and then the texts that are produced, it just made it natural for me to go to municipal archives as opposed to any other kind of archive, which, one could certainly do. Archives, judicial archives. My heart was, in municipal government. So sorry.
Having read some of these works, particularly for Dijon, I share your affinity for their curriculum. And yeah, you could definitely get a sense of the idiosyncrasies of the people who produce them, but also the local agendas. In Dijon, it was 1477. It was this sort of, they just keep going back to it. But with, so again, one of the things that I really appreciate about the book is the kind of ongoing dialogue, looking back and forth between the local and the national and the way that the two speak to each other. And so with, and thinking about that in terms of your method a little bit more, as you pointed out in the introduction to your book, you didn't do what you said other people might have done, which was to try and read all of these histories systematically and comparatively, but rather that you sort of moved, you describe yourself as moving outwards from Poitiers and following sources and networks of association and seeing where they led you, which I think is a really interesting approach. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit both about what you think that approach opened up, and maybe also, what there might still be to be done, particularly as because for instance, that northern cities and Catholic authors are overrepresented in this study. So, how might the story look a little differently if some of the threads had led you towards southern cities or Protestant authors, or is it significant that those threads didn't lead you in those directions? Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So that methodology. I think it is definite that so that methodology really led to the findings, I would say, because, what I'm trying to talk about are relationships between people, right? And the way that different interests coalesce around ideas. And like, for example, the way somebody like André Duchesne, who is Géographe du Roi, might be interested in corresponding with Jean Mounier and Autain. And, Autain is interested in the local, right? And Duchesne is interested in like a much broader history. But they still just really get into it on, like, what happened? What happened? Who was Count of Autain? In the middle of the 10th century, right? So, and they're, they go back and forth on this over and over again, right? So, so I think what the approach leads to is exactly these kinds of connections, right? And probably it leads to a view that is kind of maybe more cooperative than it actually was. I mean, perhaps there's more conflict than I identified. I mean, certainly there's lots of conflict in my book, but it tends to be kind of more local conflict rather than like any kind of, real impasses, I guess, especially between these more well-known erudits in Paris, and then the way I kind of think of them as sort of the lesser lights of the Republic of Letters, out in the provinces in France. So I think it leads to seeing connections and seeing overlaps and seeing who borrowed from whom, which is, can be very useful. But perhaps a little less of maybe the mavericks and the disagreements. Maybe fewer of those appear than might otherwise. I don't know. Another thing that it doesn't exactly give us, I think. Nicolas Chapurat at Paris Nanterre wrote a review of my book, and one thing he wanted was sort of like more almost life stories, like more, okay, they wrote this work and then what did that do for their career? That kind of question. My approach doesn't really lead to that because I'm looking more at, as I said, at ways that groups of people, create works rather than individuals, like their whole sort of intellectual life story. I'm actually working more on that now, but that's not really in the book. Right, the South. I sort of excluded the South. It's not so much that these pathways didn't go to the South. It's simply that, okay, well, when I started my project, somebody told me that there was another historian working on a broader work on urban histories in the South. And so I thought, okay, there's tons of material here. I'll just kind of focus less on that. And so, yeah, it's not that, the lines of communication didn't lead there. It's just that I didn't necessarily follow them as much for that practical reason. I think if I had focused more on Southern examples, I'm not sure that would have fundamentally changed the picture. Certainly Southern cities, I think it would maybe be more of a change in emphasis on what was of particular importance to those people. There's obviously kind of greater material remains from the Gallo-Roman past in the South that obviously makes a difference. There's there are longer-lived and stronger traditions of provincial liberties in the South. Well, Bourgogne has that too, but like Provence, for example, right? So if you look at a work on Aix-en-Provence, it's pages and pages and pages and pages of the liberties of Aix or of the county of Provence. And so I think that the emphasis would be different, and perhaps especially the way the relationship with the French crown, is laid out historically would be a little different. And yet the topics, I think would be more or less the same. I guess one thing we should add too is that because of the very strong legal and notarial tradition in the South, we have kind of more, notaries and people like that writing histories than we do in the North. But again, I think that's a little bit more of a sort of a difference in emphasis than like sort of a fundamental rewriting of.
Yeah. Oh, and of course, the role of notaries, lawyers, jurists, and writing all these histories as being part of this culture is really prominent, and I want to come back to that. But first, I want to talk a little bit, or ask you a little bit about again, sort of following up on the kind of religious angle, the sort of regional and religious angle. One of the things you do, the last sort of main chapter, you talk about the wars of religion and how memories of the wars of religion were shaped, used, and tested after the fact. So I'm wondering, especially because I'm also interested, so maybe I'll sort of combine these questions. One of the things I really appreciate about your book is the way it really does, it sort of spans the 16th, 17th centuries. I could easily have imagined you writing this book just about the 16th century or primarily about the 17th century. And often there is a kind of break right there around the reign of Henri IV. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit then about how sort of tracing this history through from really the early 16th century, really the period of the Bonneville, all the way really up through the so-called absolute monarchy, lets you kind of really get at some of these questions about Frenchness, French national identity, so on and so forth, and then particularly how the contested memory of the wars of religion could be used and shaped to kind of construct those versions of history, right? Because there's not just one single history. There are alternate local histories, or there's a kind of constellation of local histories at play here. I'm throwing a lot at you at once.
Okay.
I know.
Okay, maybe I'll start with the wars of religion.
Yeah.
And then, yeah. So yeah, the wars of religion. That is one of these topics that's just kind of developed as I was working on histories, and that topic in general. Well, I was asked to do a conference paper on the role of the wars of religion in these urban histories. And when I started to go back through my notes, I realized, oh my God, there's a lot about the wars of religion in these urban histories, and it's fascinating. And it also changes, as you move from the 16th century histories into the 17th century. So I guess what, as I started out life as a 16th century historian, and what really surprised me as I was reading the 17th century histories is, how at least in some of them, not in all of them, of course, but in some of them, how prominent the discussion of the wars of religion could be, and also how fraught it still was. So, I mean, now, in 2023, the memory of the wars of religion, a topic, right, that lots of people are interested in and lots of people are working on. And I kind of came to it, sort of on my own by reading these histories, and it just kind of jumped out at me. And so what really struck me was, not just how disagreement still rankled between Catholics and Protestants, but also how those divisions that, especially were germane to the War of the Catholic League, how those, differences of opinion, about the role of religion in public life and the role of, governments, etc., how strongly those questions were still being debated, in the first half of the 17th century. So yes, and then I really started to see that, that is one area where, conflict is the most visible in these histories. There are other topics, that become conflictual, but many of them really do have to do with religion. And so for example, one other example I have is the debate in Le Mans over the dating of the evangelization of men. And it's related, right? Because the people take different views on this, and it's kind of, there's sort of overlaps and kind of synergies with what kind of position do they take about the French church and society in the 17th century in their own times. So I think so the wars of religion really started to emerge as something very important. And then as well, when we're thinking about why are people writing these, there really is a sense, starting with the first war of religion, that all of these documents and all of these buildings are going to be destroyed. So we better figure out what they say right now before they disappear. And so that is a really, really sort of important element for, I think, why these urban histories sort of get jump started, during the period of the wars of religion. Okay, but you also asked me, let's see, you also asked me about how these sources over time wind up influencing intellectual culture, ideas of friendship, right? Yeah, and so although I often emphasize the continuities, but there really are sort of developments within the genre,
Sure,
of writing.
right, absolutely.
And I think those really do wind up being important for how writers in their towns and in their communities are thinking about the relationship between themselves, their communities, and the monarchy overall. So, I mean, one thing that happens is that, well, there's just a buildup of sources. I mean, of writing, not just urban histories per se, which then later writers can sort of use as models and sort of place themselves within the genre, but like all kinds of, basically user aids, develop. Guides to ecclesiastical councils, or lists of, I don't know, royal edicts, or saints' lives get published, books of privileges. So it becomes, there's a sort of like a broader, let's say, library for people who are interested in these topics to make use of. And so they wind up being, in greater conversation with wider groups of people who have themselves, been interested in historical topics. So in that way, the kind of the community like grows. So I think that's one thing. And so local history, I mean, you can't be quite as naive by the 17th century as you could be like in the beginning of the 16th century, when, as far as no one else has ever written about this. And, in the early 16th century, a lot of these things read like romance, not like what we would think of as actual history texts. But then also, okay, how do local communities relate to the broader one, to the monarchy? And I think there the trends in what is important to people wind up influencing what they write. And so one big example is, the increasing role of genealogy and genealogical writing. And of course, by the 1660s, right, formal investigations into nobility, right, become a major concern to local elites. And you see that, in these urban histories, because genealogical sections wind up being added. And as I think I mentioned in the book, this is kind of the first thing that elites start looking for in these books. Did they talk about my ancestors? And if so, what did they say? And did they get it right? So the relationship between localities and the monarchy is sort of an enduring theme, but how are they connected? That is something that seems to kind of shift, over time as these works develop.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the great things that you show, and that you really trace the continuities, and just that there's continuities there, but also you show how the genre itself, the points of emphasis, and what people are interested in, and their approaches to writing these histories, how they all change. I'm mindful of the time that we're about 20 to 1 out here on the West Coast. So I have sort of one final question, but I would like to encourage people who have questions for Hilary to start sending questions in the chat. And I guess this is, sort of using my prerogative here as as your interlocutor, and given my own interest in sort of lawyers. Yeah, I guess I just ask you to comment a little bit more about, because lawyers, I'm using that term very broadly, sort of men of the law, jurists, judges, officiers, seem to be really kind of at the core of all of this, both in terms of collecting and amassing a lot of these sources, and also both as writers and sort of audiences or consumers of these histories. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about sort of the men of the law as intellectuals, as kind of vocational intellectuals, which is a term I've seen used to describe them before, particularly in the provinces in the 16th and 17th century. And how that sort of, like what's the connection between law and history there? So I guess I'm going back to sort of Donald Kelly, right? In 2 minutes or less.
2 minutes or less, yes, exactly. Well, I mean, Donald Kelly had the advantage of working on, some of the greatest thinkers of the 16th century, which my guys pretty often are not.
They're not that. They're not that. Yeah, no, right.
So they're not theorists, in the way that his subjects. They're not really pushing new territory. But yes, they are definitely significant in that they are sometimes applying some of the ideas that sort of are well-known theorists of perfect are coming up with. And one of my favorite examples in that category is Jean Monnier, who I talk about, who really uses Baudin's idea of sovereignty to talk about his local community. And another person I didn't really get to talk about as much as I wanted to in the book because it was already too long, but Saint-Julien, who he has this these incredibly interesting ideas about the province of Bourgogne that are related to the way that the provincial estates work in Burgundy. And he has this idea of the way that the Gallic tribes passed around sovereignty, and is very much connected to his view of these different communities in Bourgogne that all have their own histories and they're all important in their own way. So they do use these bigger ideas. But yes, on the other hand, the history of the local community winds up being like one of these topics that, lawyers who are just sort of interested, beyond their own sphere of law, they almost feel obliged to write on this topic. There's a series of topics that you see over and over again that people write about. And one of them is the history of the community. The other is the history of the monarchy. Another is witchcraft. They're almost sort of set themes that they wind up writing about. And I think it's natural because law is, of course, an inherently historical enterprise, and as Kelly and points out, as well as most people know well, especially the French method of law, so heavily emphasizes, the historical context of laws. And then maybe this is also different about focusing on the North, but also, with customary law and the fact that it's individual and it's based, in the local area, and it is, based on what people, but mostly lawyers, of course, but people in the local community says it is, right? And as they comment on it and write how it works. So yeah, I think there's really a kind of a natural connection there that they're kind of they're sort of at the front end of, people are interested in history, right? Daniel Wolf's idea that he works on Britain, right? But the social circulation of the past, right? The fact that history is really present to these people, I think that's absolutely right, and for France as well as for England. I think lawyers really are on the forefront of this, and you showed that very well in your book on Dijon as well, and especially in the first half of the 17th century, this is really, a very important statement for them. The way that the law, which is, of course, under the authority of the king, and what is going on in the locality, are sort of fundamentally connected.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's right. I mean, I think, yeah, it's really kind of fundamentally a historical enterprise, and particularly, especially when you're dealing with customary law, I mean, because it itself is grounded in the past, right, and past practice, or at least a vision of the past, a real past. It's as.
Can I just say one more thing about this?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Kind of, since of course history is not a topic that you study in university, I'm sort of imagining all of these people, all these guys who have been forced to study years of law and really they're just kind of they're sort of saving up all of this interest in history, which then kind of pours forth when they're finished, when they've gotten their law degree. So it's either history or poetry, right, or both. Those are the things they really want to do. Even though they might have been forced to learn all of this, all of this other stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think also, right, they see themselves as part of this kind of civic elite, right? They're really imbued with the civic culture. I mean, and that I think changes over the course of the 17th century. But I think you're right about that. But for some of them, this is just they have these lawyers that I studied in Dijon are writing this sort of patois poetry, right? Which is really interesting when you think about it. So we have several questions here. They're coming in. And so actually there's quite a few. So if I know we can run a little bit past 1 o'clock if I'm right, Sally and Judy. So I'm going to try and get these questions in. So I'm going to start. It's a kind of a lengthy question from Oded Rabinovich, which I might try to sort of edit a little bit on the fly just for brevity. But he says, thank you for such a project and for stimulating discussion. And Oded would like to ask in broader terms about the literary and aesthetic elements, how those fit into changing contexts over a long period of time, following on your comment about how these histories sometimes read like romance. And linking this to one of the classic arguments early modern urban history about the declining autonomy of the banlieue. So are the writing of these histories part of this trend, but published in a shifting context where authors are perceived as more and more provincial? Because if you view it from the perspective of a Paul Cohen, are they losing by writing in French to begin with and addressing a broader audience? So no, is there kind of a nostalgia? I guess how I'm interpreting that, is there kind of a romance for a nostalgia for a past that is disappearing?
Okay. So maybe I should clarify. So when I talked about the romances, it's not that they have great literary qualities necessarily, but in the late 15th and the early 16th century, what hadn't quite developed yet was a kind of a historical sense that things were different in the past. And what existed already, were these historical, were romances, the Arthurian cycle, etc. And so sometimes when historians, write histories, they can sound very much like these romances. So, knights fighting, princes, founding towns. I think it's because that's the model of how you write, and so historians kind of pick that up. I should say that my book doesn't focus on those. I pick up with what I call erudite history, which is history that is solidly or more or less solidly, but founded in sources. But okay, so this question of the Bonneville and is this nostalgic writing?
And that might be my interpretation of the question.
I mean, I would say no. No, I mean, I think that would completely undermine my entire book to say that. No, I mean, I think that my argument is that these histories are relevant. You know, people write them because it's important. Because talking about the historical tradition and the past of the city is important. It's important for different reasons. You know, different privileges are being defended at different times. But I firmly everything I've seen is that long into the 17th century, local elites are invested in local government, and the importance that participating in it gives to them, the sort of the heft, to them and to their families. Now, I should say that my approach was to emphasize more the sort of the mid-sized towns that don't have parliaments and things like that. So maybe you would find something different, in the parliamentary towns, where certainly in Paris, right? Parliamentary officials stop participating in town government, right? I'll show that pretty clearly. And maybe in Dijon or in Bordeaux, you have a shift, right, going on. But in these towns, the mid-sized provincial capitals, elites are firmly invested, in the local, in addition, of course, to being royal office holders. And what is so significant, I think, is that both are important to their mental universe. And so when they're writing these urban histories, they're mostly either focusing most heavily, on the importance of the local, although of course they are also connected to these kind of these dynasties, of office holders. They're at the same time, and local families aren't just local necessarily. They probably have cousins or brothers who are in Paris who maybe got better jobs. They're holding nicer offices elsewhere. But the local is extremely important. You do see changes, just to answer what I think is the first question, over time in how these histories are written, or at least you see people complaining. You see people complaining about earlier histories being a little uncouth. So there's clearly changes in the way that French is written and what is deemed kind of appropriate to say over time. You get a more polite style, right, as you continue, but that doesn't sort of fundamentally change the actual. And it's largely because, they're sticking pretty close to their sources, their archival sources, which are not written in polite French, right? So yeah, the aesthetics change a little bit, but I really think that the values, really endure.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that's a. Yeah, no, I guess I would agree with that based on my limited perspective from Dijon. So what I want to, so I've been told we can take until 4:20 p.m. on the East Coast, or that's 1:20 p.m. Pacific time. So because we have quite a few questions here in the queue, so I invite people to stick around. We'll try and get through as many of these questions as we can. There are some really good ones. Andrea Frisch asks, you've focused mostly on motivation, strategies, and affordances. What do you see as some of the principal limitations and constraints on this kind of historiographical research in the period you're looking at? And what kinds of sources are privileged for recent history?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think some of the main constraints are indeed the mental universe of the people who are writing. They have all kinds of assumptions about the way that power works. And they very much assume that, the way authority is constituted, the relationship between sort of family dynamics and royal office, and sort of the power of the king, etc. They very much think that the way it works in the late 16th or the early 17th century is the way that it's always worked. So, so in some ways, they're, from our perspective, in that way, they're not good historians, in that they're always looking for, a reproduction of the present in the past. So, so they, so they're, and they're interested. So, like when they're looking at, for example, and almost all of these histories have kind of a genealogical history of the local ruling house, like whether it's the count or the duke or the viscount or whatever it is. And, it's always, they're looking for continuities, and they're looking for the passing off of power and authority from father to son, right, all the time. And, the idea that things actually worked a little bit differently, in the Middle Ages, or let alone, in the Gallo-Roman period, they either they don't understand that, or they're not interested in seeing that. I would say that is really a major constraint that they have. And then, of course, they're really limited by what sources are they able to get their hands on, which is very variable. So some historians have a lot of connections and have really been able to see a lot of sources in their own communities and elsewhere, and others really are beholden to just a very limited set, or they're only interested in a few, and then those are the ones that they use. But I would say that, but as I said, I think the biggest constraint is a kind of a limitation of imagination, that things were actually fundamentally different in the past.
Yeah, and so there are a couple of questions here, just sort of following up on that, which I think maybe follow up on that. One is from Marion, who asks, I wonder about our categories, where we think in terms of history. They may perhaps have thought in terms of genealogies and chronologies to be established. So the sources are plumbed to these ends, and we tend to look at them in terms of pauses, this especially in the 16th century. And then Austin Collins, so I'm combining these sort of two questions here that came in separately, asks, can you speak more about how national geographers and photographers such as Francois de Belforest influenced the image of small cities such as Poitiers or Angoulême, and how they might have impacted how these cities presented themselves?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me just approach the second question first. So national geographies. Well, okay, so one way that they sort of profoundly influenced the presentation of localities is that they are very heavily within the choreographical tradition. So, the elements of, the city panegyric are uppermost, is sort of in that tradition of talking about localities. And so that really influences the way that local historians, especially in the 16th century, present, their town, right? They have to go through, okay, the weather is great, we're at a fantastic location, all those things that you say in a city, a panegyric, because some of the first descriptions of localities, at least in France, do in fact come from these cosmographies and national geographies. That said, well, so for François de Belforest and his Cosmographie Universelle, I mean, what's kind of interesting about that, as I say in a chapter of the book, is that at least in certain circumstances, in many circumstances, he's using what local people tell him. You know, they wrote out what was important about their town, and he uses that. He adapts it, but you know, he lets the locals speak. And so I would say that the influence is not just in one direction. You know, it's a two-way street. You know, local testimonies wind up in the work, and then local people read that work. And oddly, you know, a cosmography winds up being a source for local history for subsequent historians. So there's a lot of sort of back and forth influence there. Later cosmographers kind of stick more to their friends, but so like when André Duchesne wants to update his cosmography, we'll call it, he asks all of his erudite buddies to send him information, and that largely follows a kind of a choreographical tradition. But yes, so back to this question about genealogies, and certainly the kinds of the format for previous writing most definitely influences what is deemed significant and how it's presented in these works. And so, yeah, genealogies are one, you know, main source for these writings. But as I said, you know, these works are, well, in the book I call them notional collections. You know, they're often works that actually include a lot of sort of smaller parts or works that are kind of strung together either more or less successfully. So genealogy only winds up influencing some, you know, of the writing because other writing, you know, takes more of the chronicle form or the annals form. Or the commented, you know, the commented cartulary form, and they all just kind of get stuff into the same work. So that's kind of a weakness of these works, but it's also a strength because within the same work you wind up getting different angles based on different genres and different kinds of sources.